Good morning, everyone. My name is Ellen Holste, and I am the Community Program Manager at Pierce Cedar Creek Institute, and I want to welcome everyone to our second Virtual Herpetology Conference. Our third talk this morning is by Shaughn Galloway. He's with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He's the Fish and Wildlife Biologist, Transportation Liaison, and he's going to talk about today the Eastern Massasauga Rattlesnake Species Recovery Plan. So thank you for joining us.
So hello everyone, I'm Shaughn Galloway. I'm with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. As Ellen said, I'm the Transportation Liaison for the state of Michigan, but I also serve as the co-species lead for Eastern Massasauga Rattlesnake. So I'm here today to talk to you guys about the Eastern Massasauga Rattlesnake Recovery Plan. So I'd like to start off this presentation by kind of covering what we mean by recovery. I know we hear recovery a lot used in our daily language, but what do we mean by recovery as far as it goes for listed species? So what we're really talking about by recovery means that we're arresting or reversing the decline of a species by removing or reducing threats to that species, with the goal of improving the likelihood that a species will persist in the wild without really any sort of external management from the federal government, at least. Recovery for the United States really has several components that are baked into it. It really kind of starts with a species status assessment, which is a multi-faceted tool that's basically a compilation of the best available scientific data to help inform listing managers, as well as provide science to support management of the species into the future. And these are really living documents, so they come up frequently as we work with the species. The next document that kind of comes up is what's called a recovery plan. These are developed once the species has been found to need listing. And once they get listed, they get a recovery plan now. Some species that were listed a while ago may not have a recovery plan, but any recent species do. These plans include what's called a recovery vision. So it's kind of an overarching umbrella for recovery of the species, a recovery strategy, which kind of identifies our game plan, and then specific recovery criteria and actions, which are actually implementable to help us achieve recovery. And then something that's kind of new in the last few years is what's called the recovery implementation strategy. And this further takes the recovery plan and it's stepped down to smaller scales to help improve implementation. And so these are developed with a variety of stakeholders, a mix of government, non-government individuals, just interested public. And then, like I said, it takes these recovery criteria and turns them into actionable tasks, and it allows land managers to more effectively engage in the recovery process. Something I would like to point out about these recovery implementation strategies and plans is that they're non-regulatory. So we have a statute to develop them under the Endangered Species Act, but there's no regulatory teeth as far as making anybody actually implement them. So having partners that are willing to implement them is really key to success. And then the other thing I want to highlight is that these do not come with any set funding source. So really emphasize the fact that there's no Section 6 money or anything else available by the creation of these recovery plans. And so, like I said, partners are really important. So the Eastern Massasauga was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act in October 2016. And since then, recovery strategies have been developed for both the United States and Canada. We utilize the Western, Central, and Eastern analysis units that were developed during the species status assessment process to kind of assess species condition and develop the recovery framework at a large scale. And I really like this map, and I think it does a great job of kind of showing where we have known information about populations, as well as the different units. But I would like to point out that the central unit has changed since the species status assessment, and that all of Michigan is now considered at least the lower peninsula and the coastal islands are now considered the central unit, and the eastern unit really falls into Canada, New York, and Pennsylvania. But as of 2014, we had about 263 extant populations. Those, of course, are across the range. And I'm assuming that there's been a few more populations found since then. We just haven't gotten to the point where we're updating this document, but this probably provides a pretty close to accurate number. So the EMR final recovery plan has, like I said, 3 components. The recovery plan vision, which is to have a sufficient number of populations with a wide geographic distribution to withstand threats to the species. And not only do we want these sufficient number and geographically dispersed, but we also want to have robust populations as far as the number of individuals with abundant habitat for all life stages. So that means having overwintering habitat for hibernation, as well as summer active season habitat, which would provide for gestation, mating, and foraging and other life history needs. And so the recovery strategy is the second part of this plan, which we try to address the key drivers impacting Massasauga populations, such as habitat loss, environmental variation like climate change, disease, and persecution. And we're really trying to just establish demographically, genetically, and physiologically robust self-sustaining populations of the species. And we use the recovery criteria and actions as a way to carry these, the plan vision and the plan strategy out. And so we established 3 recovery criteria for where we would eventually get to a point where we think about delisting the species. And these criteria are a general, I would like to point out these criteria are a general rule, but recovery can be achieved with a different mix of standards. And this kind of gets back to the original plan of using probability of persistence, which was used in the draft recovery plan. We shifted to more of a number of populations based on one of those scenarios. So we might achieve recovery through a mix of these approaches. So the criteria established under the recovery plan, the criterion 1 is kind of the main criteria that applies to all of the populations across the entire range. And that is to establish 135 robust populations with at least 80 being self-sustaining. And robust population means greater than 50 adult females with a stable and increasing growth rate. And if you look at the map on the right side of the slide, you can see that how this looks broken down by each unit. And for example, in the Western unit, we need to have at least, of those 135 populations, 11 should be occurring in the Western unit. And then at least 4 of those populations in the number in the parentheses need to meet criterions 2 and 3, which criterion 2 is to establish an adequate quantity and configuration of lands committed to managing for EMR at least 25 years after delisting. So this is an important one because we want to make sure that not only are we establishing populations, but we're establishing populations with a high probability of success. And then criterion 3 would be to treat or that threats from climate change and disease are addressed in a way that supports robust populations of eastern Massasauga. So assessing impacts like flooding and disease like snake fungal disease. So under the recovery criteria, we're now into the recovery actions. And so I've included the recovery actions from the recovery plan as well as some ideas for what that might look like in application. So the first one is to halt and reverse declines. So we'd like to establish demography sites so we can have a good sense of how populations are doing in a specific geographic area. We want to maintain and enhance habitat within our known populations, and we want to reduce persecution and other forms of mortality as a general way to halt these and reverse these declines. We want to ensure the adaptive diversity for the species is maintained. So identifying these critical populations for protection and survey these unknown / historical areas to see if we have populations persisting that might offer unique genetic information. We want to also, the next step would be to increase public tolerance and support for EMR conservation. And so being a venomous snake is a really hard road for getting people to like you. Generally, people don't tend to like snakes, and the fact you're venomous makes it that much harder. But I think that there's a way to increase tolerance based on all the ecological services that these individuals provide, such as protecting our wetlands and reducing rodent populations. And so I think that we have an opportunity to do some positive outreach, garner landowner support, and provide incentives for land management practices. And then finally, we want to increase our knowledge and understanding of eastern Massasauga. So we want to continue to research the species to better improve management, understand the effects of land management actions, understand disease, the effects of climate change, if propagation's a possibility, and then potential reintroductions to improve that distribution. So that is the federal recovery process, kind of stepped down from the overall goal of listing the species and then identifying threats and trying to reduce that at, the 30,000 foot view. The recovery implementation strategies are really the kind of where the rubber meets the road, I would argue. And so for the Eastern Massasauga Rattlesnake, each state within the range has developed its own recovery implementation strategy. And today I'm going to really focus on Michigan's recovery implementation strategy. So this was developed by conservation partners in Michigan. I'm assuming that some of you are on the call and you had an integral role in the development of this strategy, but it's based on a 5-year planning cycle. So right now we're in 2020 to 2025. Our current version was finalized in March 2020, but these documents are living and can be updated as needed to improve adaptive diversity and adaptive management. But the goal of this strategy was to really step down the guidance from the recovery plan down into the 4 geographic focus areas based on the ecological diversity within the state, and to really kind of help foster collaborations among landowners and land managers. And in Michigan, we have the Southwest, Southeast, Northern, and Coastal Island regions as far what we focus on in the recovery implementation strategy. The other thing that came out of the recovery implementation strategy was a working group that was part of the development of the strategy, as well as this group continues to meet and monitor progress and promote collaboration. So this includes, again, a mix of government and non-government stakeholders. At one time, we had more subcommittees, but right now we have 2 subcommittees, which include the research and outreach subcommittees. So really, these 2 are trying to capture some of the criteria that we've established above. And then we have annual meetings, with the most recent one coming up this spring. And we are hoping to share implementation efforts and lessons learned to improve the management of habitat for Eastern Massasauga and foster additional collaboration. And these activities are being tracked via Survey 123. So each year we send out a link to Survey 123 where land managers have been putting in what they've done in regards to promoting Eastern Massasauga population. So that way we can kind of track progress over time. And I just want to give a big shout out to Michigan Natural Features Inventory. They're the one that set this up and have been helping us synthesize this data. So Michigan's recovery implementation strategy is really broken down into 5 actions that the working group found to be most important for conservation of Eastern Massasauga rattlesnakes in Michigan. These activities were broken, or actions were broken down by activity types, which include several different activities, partners that might be interested in collaborating, and then the regional priority for each of these activities. It also includes metrics to demonstrate if outcomes have been achieved, which is, I think, really important as we go through this process. And so the regional priorities that were developed, and when I say regional priorities, I include this based on having different priorities within each region, include the continue to improve habitat at EMR sites, and action 2 is acquire and protect lands. Some statewide priorities where they were kind of given a top priority across the entire state include to continue to monitor populations to improve our understanding of the species and guide conservation efforts, research threats to the species, and develop and implement outreach and education plans. So now I'm going to kind of take this down and touch on the top 1 or 2 priorities in each of the regional actions, because this kind of like now boils down to where we're at in Southern Michigan. So Northern Michigan has similar priorities in different, maybe different orders, but I'm really just going to focus on Southern Michigan with this one. So for action 1, the 1C was, which is implement habitat management projects with the goal of improving/retaining habitat. This was the #1 priority identified by both Southwest and Southeast Michigan regions. And some of the factors affecting habitat retention include vegetation succession, habitat fragmentation, changes in hydrology, and introduction or expansion of invasive species. And so some people ask, like, what can I do to improve habitat for this species? So reducing woody vegetation encroachment into meadows and fens is a really important management goal. This can be done using a variety of mechanisms, everything from hand trimming vegetation and removing trees, to burning, or even mowing. But I just want to point out that some of these things you have to be careful with timing, because EMR could be exposed to that management action and potentially injured. So use best management practices when approaching these types of actions. The second thing you could do is reduce linear features within eastern Massasauga habitat. So this is like things like roads and trails that functionally break habitat and maybe separate winter grounds from active season upland habitat. Prevents populations from reaching each other. So if we can reduce the amount of roads and trails, that's obviously better for the species. Or build smart roads and trails that include passage characteristics like big culverts to allow individuals to move through the linear feature. Managing habitat to improve transition zones is another place where we can do a lot of good things by reducing the amount of encroachment of woody vegetation that might separate upland from wetland habitat. And then avoid substantial changes in hydrology during the inactive season, so that way we don't impact hibernating individuals, as well as maintaining wetlands by not dewatering and converting to ag or other land uses. And then manage to remove invasive species that have established and prevent establishment of new invasive species are great actions to take on. Preventing the establishment of invasive species can be done with simply just cleaning your equipment between job sites. Action 2 is really summed up as acquire and protect lands. These 2A and 2B were flip-flopped for southeastern and southwestern Michigan. And so I'm including both here. In northern Michigan, there was an emphasis placed on this, but it was less because I think there's more public land availability where eastern Massasaugas occur in northern Michigan. So 2A is to develop acquisition criteria and prioritize EMR sites and then their parcels. And then this 2B is work collaboratively with partners to acquire parcels or easements around high priority areas. So these things really go hand in hand. And some considerations you might think about when you're purchasing land is, the size of the parcel, proximity to known populations, and current status of the land. So is it encumbered? Is it agriculture? Are there other things that we need to consider? The role of the acquisition is very important to think about as well. Is it providing for connectivity for the species? Is it providing a habitat type that might be limited in the landscape? Think about what the benefit you can provide the population, so that way when you go into it, you can make the best decision possible. Management strategy and roles is incredibly important, because this will kind of tell you, when you approach a land purchasing opportunity, it allows you to kind of identify up front, who's my partners, what are we going to do, how are we going to manage this property into the future, so that way it can continue to provide, or start to provide for eastern Massasauga rattlesnakes. And then also consider the roles of temporary acquisitions. So short-term conservation programs, like working with private landowners to manage their land in a way that promotes eastern Massasauga rattlesnakes. And so some of these mechanisms to do this include the use of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Partners programs and Natural Resource or NRCS to do their land management grants. These are just two options, and there's probably a lot more out there. But I just want to highlight the thought of using the temporary acquisition to kind of promote the habitat, which might be cheaper and easier to maintain for a longer term period. And finally, I just want to say, recovery is not possible without partners. And in this slide, I've highlighted the group that kind of contributed to the development of the Michigan Recovery Implementation Strategy. We have a lot of partners statewide. And I'm sorry if I missed anybody on this list, but I just really want to say thank you to all of our partners, because there's not a lot of funding. There's not funding associated with the recovery plans and the recovery implementation strategy. So everything that you guys are doing to promote this species is really what's going to count when it comes to recovery. So I just want to say thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I've provided the links to some of the recovery and planning resources. So the species status assessment and recovery plan. For the recovery implementation strategy, we don't quite have this yet available publicly facing, so just email me if you'd like a copy. I think all of the partners for the working group were given a copy already too. So, but eventually we'll be switching websites to a new facing website within the service, and I'm hoping to feature a lot of these documents on there as well. So thank you, everyone.
Wonderful. You answered one of my questions right away. My first question was, where do we find this information? So that's great. And everyone that is joining us via Zoom or signed up through our Zoom stuff, you will get an email with this information. So don't worry about writing it all down right now. I will make sure those links are in that email, that follow-up email as well. So feel free to put in your questions in the chat or Q&A. I know that's a lot of information on how we're going to help save and protect these, but it's very interesting to me that there's no, as you mentioned, there's no regulatory teeth on this or any funding. So it sounds like you really rely on your partners to help make some of this work. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, it's definitely 100% partner-based. Once the species is listed, there's what's called Section 7 consultation, which is consultation with the federal government. And so under that Section 7 consultation, they have Section 7A1, which is, every federal agency is to promote listed species. So sometimes we can see different partners using 7A1 to kind of look to recovery plans, but outside of that, it's individual and totally volunteer basis, which is kind of amazing that we have so much support through, for this, which I really appreciate. And it really inspires me as a biologist to keep working with these species.
There was a great question that just came in the chat. Who can we write in order to light some fires for you to get funding? Is there any place that we can help get funding, or is it mainly through other organizations that have their own funding?
I would encourage you to work with other organizations to see where they need help. Like Pierce Cedar Creek, you guys are awesome. And there's a lot of organizations that are land managers that have land that could use funding to help with, doing vegetation management, acquisitions. So I would encourage you to look in the recovery implementation strategies for potential partners to collaborate with. Giving the federal government money is not, it's kind of, we really can't do that. There's just a lot of mechanisms in place where we can't really have that. So I would just encourage you to support us by supporting the partners that are wanting to help the species.
So there was a question, I think, from one of the partners. Is there a location established yet for the annual meeting for the spring? Do we know when that's happening?
We are working, we have a tentative date. We just started firing up that engine a couple weeks ago. It's going to be virtual again, just because of the presence of COVID-19. But hopefully next year we might be able to go back to in person, but it will be, we're looking at the front part of April. And we'll be sending out some emails in the next week or so, prompting folks for questions that they would like and topics that they'd like to see covered in the meeting, and have a lot more meeting resources available. So I encourage everybody to join.
So I had a question in terms of partners. I know there are definitely landowners that would have Eastern Massasauga rattlesnakes on their property. Is the partners mainly organizations, or can local landowners get involved somehow, or do they have to go through these organizations? Do you know how that works?
I call it everybody and anybody that's willing. I highlight organizations because sometimes they're easier to think about for me, but anybody that's willing to do something on their land ownership I'm happy to help however I can.
Wonderful.
Some of the private landowners have a lot of land, and they do a lot, and it's huge for conservation when we can work on private land. And there's been a lot of studies that have shown the success rate of delisting goes up when you have more private land involvement.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. We did have one question in the Q&A that came through in regards to partners and recovery protection groups. Sometimes not all partners agree, right? Just like in life, not everybody agrees. So what kind of agreement do you see among the partners, and how unanimous is it? I know I've been on some of those meetings, but I'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, so I'm going to caveat this first with I'm fairly new to Michigan. I've been here for about a year and a half now. And it's been all COVID, so I haven't been able to see really a lot in person. But from what I have seen, it seems like there's a lot of consensus among the group as far as what's needed and the general need to recover the species. And everybody seems to be very high functioning and very engaged in the process, which is really helpful and really appreciated.
And I know very passionate, at least all the partners that I have met, people that know about EMRs, Eastern Massasauga Rattlesnakes, tend to be very, very passionate about them. And so that's the great part. So
yeah, it's a really cool species, and it's a lot of fun to work with.
Great. Well, I don't have any other questions. Thank you everyone for joining us today.
Yep.
So if you do have questions and want to follow up with Shaughn and what's going on with EMR, feel free to email him, I'm going to say, for you.
Yep, that's totally fine. And thank you everyone for joining the call, and excellent job to all the presenters. I've really enjoyed listening to all the presentations on the different species. So